So hi everyone, welcome to the webinar Crowdsourcing Exhibitions Lessons Learned, part of the AAMC's Professional Development Committee webinar series. My name is Rebecca McNamara and I'm the Mellon Collections Curator at the Tang Teaching Museum in very chilly Saratoga Springs, New York at Skidmore College. So thank you for joining today. So throughout this session, I'll be asking our panelists questions, and we welcome you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your window to ask questions as they arise throughout the session. And I'll be sure to try to address as many audience questions as I can throughout the session. You'll see a notification that the chat feature is disabled, so anything you want to communicate to myself or our panelists, please just use that Q&A button. Before I get to introducing our panelists today, I just want to take a moment to define crowdsourcing. So crowdsourcing is the act of obtaining information or services by enlisting as large a number of people as possible, usually through the internet. So it's really about working with as many people as possible and not necessarily traditional sources or art world insiders or experts. And so we'll be talking about the many ways that museums have used crowdsourcing in the past. So today we have with us Katie Buckingham, the curator at the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, Washington, Eric Schmaltz, citizen history community manager at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Daniel Sharp, arts outreach specialist at Kickstarter. So our panelists will start off by discussing the successes and the challenges of three different types of ways that museums have used crowdsourcing. So there'll be cross-pollination, but for the most part, Katie will be speaking about a project she did where she was actually crowdsourced the curatorial task of choosing objects for display, which as a curator feels like a very scary thing. So I'm interested to hear how everything went. Eric will discuss his project where he's actually asking for services like research, information gathering, transcription, ways that the public can actually provide those kinds of services. And Daniel will speak mainly to using online platforms to raise funds. So it would be great if you could each just introduce yourselves a little bit more and talk about each of your projects. Katie, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, I'm Katie Buckingham. I work at Museum of Glass in, I can't believe it, sunny Tacoma, Washington. We had an exhibition, well, as some experiments here at the museum have come about, our exhibition, #BeTheCurator, was sort of an accident at first. We had a hole in our exhibition schedule, which we only had about 2 months notice to fill. So we did a permanent collection show, which was pretty standard, but because we didn't have time to really do a big curatorial look into our collection, we thought it would be fun to experiment. So we took it was about 50 works in the show, and we put them on Facebook and asked people to vote with the idea that a year later we would have a crowd curated show of favorites from our collection. So we had notice of the voting process in the gallery, but most of the crowdsourcing was done by collecting Facebook likes, essentially. And it was moderately successful. We were able to pare the list down, and our marketing department was excited. We engaged new users, but where I was really intrigued was the amount of messages we got through Facebook asking questions about not just the artwork or the artist, but why that 50. People were really curious about how we arrived at that 50. So it became the seed of our Be the Curator exhibition, which was here at the museum in 2016. So we took the 30 most popular works from that original Facebook poll, and we put them in the gallery, and we made the gallery social media themed. So every artist got a profile instead of a bio. The labels were the actual comments from the Facebook album, and each pedestal got a box for physical likes. So the idea we wanted to experiment with was what would happen if we made the gallery into a social media style experience. I did a lot of research at the time about the parallels between curating an art exhibition and curating your life on social media. So what it means to edit your photos or create an album or share articles. We used all of those parallels to teach visitors about what it means to curate an exhibition in the gallery. So the mechanism for liking, if you will, in the gallery was a token. And the other really important outcome we wanted to explore was teaching people that on the internet, likes have a monetary value for companies who are using them. So to mimic that, we awarded the artist with the most likes in the gallery a residency in our hot shop. So we have a working glassblowing studio that's part of our museum, and we award a 5-day residency to about 30 to 45 artists a year. And it ends up being a $25,000 opportunity for them. So to hand that power over to our visitors was really exciting. We ended up receiving 56,000 likes throughout the course of the show, and we were able to award a residency to the winning artist. And I think for me, the biggest success was also sort of a failure for our marketing team. It was way more engaging in the gallery than it was on Facebook. So Happy Art Curator was like, oh great, people still want to see the things in person. But it was an interesting, the reason it became a social media themed exhibit was because it failed on our actual social media channel. So we tried to use the questions that we got through our Facebook chat to inform the narrative of the show.
So the exhibition wasn't like the curatorial team still had a lot of say in what was actually shown in the exhibition because you didn't feel like you were getting enough Facebook engagement?
We let Facebook dictate the 30 pieces that were in the show. It just was not the smashing success of voting we were hoping it would be online. So for us, the really big crowdsourcing momentum occurred when it was actually in the gallery and people could interact with the artwork in person instead of looking at a photo.
That is very encouraging to
right.
hear. Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about your History Unfolded project?
Sure. My name is Eric Schmaltz. I'm the History Unfolded Citizen History Community Manager at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And History Unfolded is a really exciting ongoing project for us at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. We started in November of 2015, so almost 3 years ago to this day, and we're continuing through 2021. We're calling this citizen history, which is a particular variation on crowdsourcing in which we are combining the more traditional elements of having individuals send us data, in this case, newspaper information to the project website. But an equal goal for us is to make sure that this particular project has a very strong educational value to the participants who are doing it. So we're just as focused on what our participants are getting out as much as what we're getting in. And so essentially what History Unfolded is a effort for teachers, students, and lifelong learners around the country to look into their local newspaper collections, see how their communities reported on different events of the Holocaust in their newspapers from the period of 1933 to 1945. And so we are looking for contemporary reporting on the Holocaust. And we have a series of events for research. Right now, some of these are particular events of the Holocaust in Europe, and other events are the American connection. So we have events such as Kristallnacht, which we have an anniversary that just happened earlier this month on. And then the announcement or confirmation of the final solution is another event. But then we have particular American connection stories like Dorothy Thompson and her expulsion from Germany, and then the liberation of the camps. And so we're asking the students and the teachers, educators, and adult volunteers to find these newspaper articles on these events, ideally in their local community and libraries, archives, historical societies, and upload metadata to our project website, which is newspapers.ushmm.org. Like I said, it's an ongoing project, so we'd love to have as much help on this project as we can. And they submit the metadata So that would be the newspaper name, the issue date, page number, and associated material that we'll be sharing with scholars of the Holocaust and digital humanities historians. And they upload an image, right now mostly for verification of that metadata. That's one of my jobs, to make sure that the information is accurate and relevant. And then if all checks out, we approve it to the public end of the website. So that metadata becomes instantly available to anyone with internet access. The project has been very successful so far. We've had over 10,000 people register for an account to History Unfolded, including 2,000 plus teachers. We've had over 3,000 people participate. I think that number is even higher because sometimes we have teachers that create a group for all their students. We've had data from all 50 all states across the country on History Unfolded. And we've had participation from schools like in Puerto Rico, for instance. We've had newspaper data from the US Virgin Islands. We've had over 100 institutions get involved. And just like Katie was talking about earlier, there's a particular connection to a physical exhibition. One thing that was really exciting for History Unfolded was that we started this project before our Americans in the Holocaust special exhibition opened. And that's part of our larger initiative on Americans in the Holocaust. So the idea was, could we get members of the public to help us look into local newspaper collection, because our team of historians was too small to do all this work on our own, and in the process challenge their own misconceptions about the Holocaust and learn how to do real historical research, and then actually help shape the physical space. And that's what happened. We have over a dozen newspaper articles featured on an interactive wall map in the Americans in the Holocaust exhibition, articles that are featured on our online version of the exhibition, which you can find from our main museum website. And we also have some quotations from the Wagner-Rogers Child Refugee Bill, in which citizen historians did a research sprint, and some of those quotations are actually featured on the panels of the physical space. So it's been a really exciting experiment for us so far. It's our first full-scale citizen history project.
Great, thank you. I have a lot of follow-up questions for you, for both of you as well, but before we get to them, Daniel, can you talk a little bit about crowdfunding? How do we raise funds from lots of people?
So absolutely. So my name's Daniel Sharp. I work on the arts team at Kickstarter, which is about 3 people. Kickstarter, of course, was started in 2009. The arts team has been around for about 5 or 6 years or so. And we primarily work across 4 of the 15 categories on Kickstarter. So that's arts, photography, dance, and theater. Of course, any given day, there's probably 40 projects that launch in all of those categories every day. So we're not working with everyone. It's usually around 8 to 10% of all projects that either are organically coming in on the site or that we're helping to bring in, we're working with. So of course, that ranges pretty much anyone who uses Kickstarter, which is a totally open platform. Anyone can launch a project there, but it includes, for us, it's a lot of artists, it's museums, it's public art nonprofits, it's galleries, collectives, pretty much you name it. But all of them are usually on Kickstarter trying to seek funding for a specific project. The 2 examples I kind of want to hone in on today are 2 museums. One was the Nevada Museum of Art and Public Art Fund, which is a arts nonprofit based in New York. They've actually both done 2 Kickstarter campaigns, so I think they also have really good suggestions as to their first project, and then they had lessons learned, and then they did their second project, which is more often than not more successful than the first one. So the first one, Nevada Museum of Art, they ran a campaign with Ugo Rondinone with the 7 Magic Mountains. That was, I think, back in 2015 or 16 or so. And then they ran their second one last year, which was Trevor Paglin's Orbital Reflector. And so both of these projects with the Nevada Museum of Art, they're of course paired with an actual physical exhibition in the space, but these Kickstarters are usually for something that is going to exist outside of the walls of the exhibition, which is something, kind of a theme that we usually see happen with museums, is that if they have an exhibition, but the artist wants to bring like a larger portion of the project, maybe it is for Ugo, right, that's 7 30-foot tall sculptures in the middle of the desert. And then Trevor Paglen's project, which was to launch the first art object into orbit with SpaceX. These are both huge, very physical, outside, extremely imaginable, and both really have great stories and a great narrative that their community, not only the members, not only the staff, but the people who just come or maybe have come to the museum just one time or just know about it. It's an excuse for them to get involved in kind of a deeper level too. Then Public Art Fund, of course, they've run 2 campaigns. The first large one was Ai Weiwei's project, Good Fences Make Good Neighbors. That happened last year. It was a 300 site-specific installation across all 5 boroughs in New York, which is a huge behemoth task. And then just this year, they ran a campaign for an artist, Tauba Auerbach, which was called Flow Separation, which was to repaint a old World War I historic tugboat, fireboat, in a kind of design that's inspired by fluid dynamics, and give free tours to the public in Gowanus, around Governor's Island. But again, both of those projects, as Public Art Fund's known for, are physical and they're outside. They're experiences that anyone, especially with Ai Weiwei's campaign, literally anyone who lives in New York in any of the 5 boroughs could go walk to and see an exhibition or see part of the exhibition. So they feel like, and we'll kind of tease this out more, but usually these projects have this sense of like community and larger purpose, and also a sense of something that this is a call to action, and has kind of a greater, larger narrative. So with Ai Weiwei's, of course, that's his Good Fences Make Good Neighbors is a way for people to say that, you know, immigrants have a deep history in New York, and they have a deep history in the fabric of just urban planning and the roads we walk on and drive on. And so that was a way, whether you're giving, you know, $1, $5, $1,000, $10,000, you're helping kind of affirm that message. And you say that this project is helping my story and my narrative. It makes me feel like the community I want to see in New York exist and feel bolstered and feel empowered. And the same thing, of course, with Trevor Paglen's project with the orbital reflector. This was a huge monumental project that's been like 2 or 3 years in the making. And it's actually launching literally, I think the orbital reflector is launching like Friday. It's like tomorrow or something. But again, this is a project for the space community. This is a project for people who are interested in Area 51. This is a project that's known to the Nevada community that is about space exploration, science, technology. And by giving, you know, again, $1, $5, $10, $100, whatever, they're helping affirm something that is going to happen for the first time in history. And so again, we see these kind of threads of like something for the first time, a narrative that feels, you know, extremely inclusive and open to anyone who wants to be part of. And more often than not, we see people engage not just in the dollar amount too. And that's kind of the glory of running a Kickstarter, is you're not only getting funds for just the project to actually happen, but you're building a community in preparation for something that is about to happen too. So you're almost guaranteeing an audience too, and you're building resources for that person to feel more excited to, you know, maybe be a member, or maybe the next time you do a Kickstarter, also fund, maybe fund on a larger amount too. So it's all about kind of a long game and investment, and kind of, you know, throwing the net farther than you ever have before, and really kind of galvanizing the community that's been following you.
That's so interesting. I feel like a few threads came up in each of your case studies about calls to action. So these like big first time projects, Eric with educational components, Katie's project with creating a residency, as well as community building. There's definitely a sense of community building that's running through all of these. So I hope we can tease that out a little more. I wonder if those are some of the barometers for successful crowdsourcing projects in museums. Daniel, you mentioned that when arts institutions participate more than once, they're usually more successful the second time. So I'm curious kind of why that is, and what you want curators or other arts professionals to know before embarking on this kind of crowdfunding campaign.
Absolutely. So I think, of course, I want to preface it with pretty much anyone can introduce themselves to me, have a conversation, say, I want to do this. What are your thoughts? that's basically my job here, is to help kind of, I say it's somewhere between like being a coach and assistant and also being a cheerleader to kind of push the project along. But more often than not, when projects come to us, especially in particular museums and nonprofits who have, say, a board, they've got a development team, they have a communications team, they have kind of the infrastructure to make a project super successful. What we're usually looking for, especially for projects to be as successful, is the narrative, and it's the story, and it's the kind of tone that you want to bring into the conversation. And that more often than not means a project that is resonating with something that is happening or ongoing in the news. So with IOAs, of course, it was perfectly timed with the immigration reform and the immigration question in America. And this was a way for New Yorkers to feel like this place or this space is safe for immigrants. It's something that resonates, on kind of a larger scale. So usually that's what we're kind of looking for, is, or say when a museum comes to us and is like, we have 3 potential projects that any of these could be funded on Kickstarter. Which one's the best? And so that's usually what we're looking for. It's also, I think, and this is kind of a good example with the Nevada Museums of Art, is the tone and the language that you're using. It's really an opportunity to be much more open and maybe more forthcoming, maybe a little bit more informal too, and also excited. So I say, like, don't write the text of a Kickstarter campaign like you would a grant, or what you would to someone who might be a benefactor. Write it like you would write something to your best friend to get them really excited about an exhibition, right? So that might mean using exclamation points. It might mean using GIFs or GIFs, and having that kind of sense of much more intimacy and less formal language actually makes the campaign feel much more accessible. And so that was kind of the difference between Ugo Rondinones, which was run in a very much more traditional sense of fundraising, which is like, we have artworks that are for sale, we have tote bags, and we have like $5 thank you invitations. But then the Trevor Paglen one was a little bit more open. There are, like exclamation points in the text. There are patches that you can sew on to any kind of fabric that actually has the mock-up of Trevor's piece of the thing that it's going to launch too. And it felt like when you're participating, right, whether that means you're going into the museum, or you're spending $5 in the campaign and you're getting a patch, or you're actually getting a Trevor Paglen artwork too, right? It's about opening that up so that people feel that they're much more connected than just going to it. So I think that's like definitely something I aim for, is for like Kickstarters to be a moment for you to kind of like reassess some of the language you're using and be more open and exciting, so that the people, right, who have maybe come just once, or maybe have wanted to come for a while and haven't missed it, or have missed it every now and then, have this chance be a way for like a really easy first step into the conversation, the projects that you're starting to. So again, that's like tone, that's giving people access. That also requires working across teams too. So this is definitely, if you're going to run a Kickstarter, it's not just going to be the development team. It's going to be development, it's going to be curators, it's going to be communications, design. The board can be involved if they want to, whether that means doing a matching week, or someone giving an angel donation, or someone deciding that they want to bring 10 people into the project, whatever. But it's basically an excuse for you, right? Like, as I said, make that net as larger and as wide as you can imagine, and invite people in more than just asking for a dollar amount.
The question of language is really interesting, because online platforms usually lend themselves to more casual language, and we often see that a lot in various types of online platforms. Eric, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the types of language that you've been using as the project evolves, and as a way to get participants and keep participants involved, because you're dealing with a topic where emojis and GIFs and exclamation points are probably not appropriate in a lot of ways. So I'm curious how you contend with language in the online space with participants.
Yeah, that's a great question. We do a couple of different things. I think you're definitely right that we have to be sensitive to the topic that we're dealing with in terms of the Holocaust. I just think one thing that sort of naturally provides that sense of connection in my role is I'm the community manager. I've been hired full time to communicate with our project participants. So just having that human being to interact with, to put kind of a public face to the project, we have found has been hugely helpful and successful to the work that we're doing in general. And so knowing that the language, whatever it is coming from me and I'm writing it in my own words, either through a message from our email team that's coming to all of our registrants on social media. We have a Facebook group, so giving updates that way. And some of it does depend on the platform. I'm a little bit more informal with our Facebook groups, some of our more involved participants. A lot of what I'm doing is not only making it clear that I'm reviewing their work and their work is being included in the work of the museum, but if you are one of many, many participants that is involved with this project. So when I think about how to engage people, I'm thinking of showcasing other participants' work. We call them our citizen historians. So in terms of, here's a school group where the students are looking at their microfilm reader and they're submitting these great articles, or talking about how fascinating some of the coverage is from our research that's been done across the country, where you see letters to the editor, editorials in which we're proving the very basis of this project that Americans did have access to information about the Holocaust, and in many cases they were responding. And so sometimes it's more of a matter of the specific content that people are finding, sharing out, with others. One sort of strategy that we've developed that we found over time has been really successful is we can incorporate certain elements of, we want to call it game theory, or challenges, as we like to call them, that we think are, and we have found they're still pretty appropriate. So when we have research requests that I send out, right now we have one on the rescue of Danish Jews, a new event module we've added to the website.
I think Eric is frozen for me. Give him a minute to revive. All right. Maybe we can come back to Eric's question in a minute since he seems to have frozen. I want to talk too along this lines of how we're communicating and the language we're using. I'm curious who the participants in these projects are. So Katie, you were saying that you felt like the engagement was so much stronger in the gallery space, and I'm curious who it was that was participating on Facebook directly, and Danielle as well, like who it is that is participating. Is it mostly the people in Nevada and people who have this innate interest in space for the one project, for example, and kind of like are these crowdsourcing projects allowing museums to reach broader populations? Do you want to take it, Katie?
Yeah, sure. For us, Facebook was exciting because a lot of the comments and questions that we got were from outside of our region here in the Northwest. Most of our physical visitors are from around the greater Pacific Northwest, but we received questions from Jerusalem and Dubai and a couple of places in Europe, because our Facebook community is usually a glass art specific community. And so there are a lot of pockets around Europe and in the Middle East that are following us to watch our hot shop online and do other things. So it was interesting to get a different opinion. There's one abstract sculpture that was in the show in particular that a visitor wrote this really beautiful 3 or 4 sentences connecting the piece to her interpretation of the Quran, which I'm sure, given that the artist grew up in Seattle, never even occurred to him to do, but it was a cool moment for us to just put an object out there and let all responses be good responses.
And those perspectives that are coming in, were they can you just remind us if they're coming in publicly in the comments of Facebook? So everyone
Yeah. They were, and we did have a couple of instances where we had to do some moderating of our Facebook page, but we did pre-select the objects that we thought would be the most neutral. There are some objects in our collection that I probably wouldn't put out there for public comment, but mostly people were really respectful, and a lot of their questions were more museum studies focused than I would have ever predicted. A lot of like, wow, how do you care for that object? Or that looks really fragile. Or, you know, why are all of these sculptures and not glasses or vases or things people recognize in glass? So I was pleasantly surprised. I think our marketing department was disappointed by the volume of online participation, but I was really pleased by those that did participate were thoughtful, and it ended up being a good experiment, I think.
Well, I think it's pretty amazing too, even if the volume was low, to have reached international audiences who were engaged enough to actually comment. Feels like a pretty...
Yeah, it was cool. It was cool. We only get 100,000 or 125,000 actual visitors a year. So if you scale it for how big the online world is, I think we fared pretty well.
Yeah. And Daniel, could you talk a little bit about who is participating?
Yeah. And I feel like we could also have an entire conversation about just moderation.
Right.
Huge. So with Kickstarter, of course, it's usually around 60 to 80% of the people who are pledging are people within the project creators community. So the project creator is the person who's actually making it. So in Trevor Paglin's case, that means it's the Nevada Museum of Art. So it's on average, right, around 60, 80% are people that are in the Nevada Museum of Art community. That could include board members, that could include staff, it could be people who just come, it could be members, it could be people who have never come, right? Or someone who's just interested because they live in the city that Nevada Museum of Art is in. Usually around, so that means then it's like 20, 40%. Oftentimes we see it's around 22 or so. That's the community that comes from Kickstarter side. And that's usually because we've put it in a newsletter, we've done a Facebook post, we've done an Instagram post, but it's never more than half. So that's like, again, one reason why you should probably run a Kickstarter campaign is that there's usually a organic growth in audience. So it's very, very similar to what Katie's saying, which is like someone from Dubai or someone from the UK might just literally decide to be interested in the project and donate. So in Trevor Paglin's project, you can go, like if you visit the site too, there's the campaign, there's FAQs, there are updates, which is one channel that the Nevada Museum of Art can keep people updated. So of course that project was delayed a few times because launching something in orbit is a pretty crazy idea. So that's one channel too that they're communicating like, hey, this got delayed, or hey, we finally have a launch date. And then there's comments. So of course another channel of communication too, who's talking, who isn't. The comments that I see right now in the Nevada Museum of Art's project too, there are actually a lot of scientists, and there are a lot of people really interested in the actual, how is this going to launch? What's the material? Is it Mylar? Is it something different? And it's a way, and like Nevada Museum of Art is really good actually responding too. And and again, similar with the tone, they like one comment from Ruben W., who is considered a super backer on Kickstarter. So that's someone who's backed like hundreds of projects. He's asking a question like, if you find an opportunity to snap some pictures from the sculpture, I'm not in the vicinity of Nevada. And then the Nevada Museum of Art gets to respond, and all of this is a public dialogue too. And they say, thank you so much for everyone who support. We made it. I will send you pictures, like send me your email, and then they show the email. So it's really right. It's an opportunity to actually have that dialogue that maybe someone in development or communications would very likely not have because they're in that position and they're not people who are like in the actual galleries. But it's a way to communicate too. And then of course the last button is community too, so you can see where backers come from. So the largest amount was actually New York. Reno, which is where Nevada Museum of Art is actually third. So New York had 49 backers, Brooklyn had 31, and then Reno had 27. So there's a lot of East Coast interest, people who are probably never going to go to the actual exhibition itself, but will probably see the thing like, circling around the world. 40 people from the UK, 24 from Germany, 23 from Canada, and it goes on from there too. So again, it's more than half is usually your own community, and then there's going to be this group of people that you've actually just captured into the conversation because they're excited about it and they want to ask questions.
Great, thank you. Eric, welcome back.
Yeah.
Glad to have you live again. So we were just talking about participants. So if you'd like to finish some of your comments about language, but also talk about who you find are actually, you've talked about students and teachers, but I'm interested to know if the people participating in crowdsourcing projects of different types are people who aren't regular visitors to an institution, maybe didn't even know about the institution before the project started, and just kind of if this is a way that museums can reach broader and more diverse audiences.
Certainly. And yeah, I apologize for that. I don't know. We have a wintry mix here in the DC area, so I don't know if that's causing my internet to go out, but fingers crossed I'll be able to stay on from here on out. So just to finish up from my last response about language, we do research challenges, like we have one on the rescue of Danish Jews right now, where we're asking people to research this new topic on our website. And we have a particular number. We're inviting the community to research. We say, can you collectively find 300 articles by November 30th? So sometime having a number and a date that's somewhat reasonable, challenging, but not insurmountable really motivates people. We specifically don't need that deadline, but it's really helpful for getting people to, number one, have a direction of where to go with their research, and knowing, here's the progress towards their goal. We also do research sprints with local libraries. We've done them at the Library of Congress. We've had libraries around the country do them. And that's a way where we can have particular themed topics for research, where individuals are researching either several topics on History Unfolded or several years, or looking into, like we did one on how military communities responded to the events of the Holocaust. We did one once on how newspapers in Hawaii responded. So we were actually able to make that more engaging and fun while being respectful of the seriousness of the topic, in which people were dressed up in Hawaiian shirts and leis and everything. So that was a way to really get people involved. As far as the community, I work with people from elementary and middle school students all the way up through Holocaust survivors on this project, both as participants and, for instance, we have a survivor who's a reviewer for our newspaper data. So it's pretty amazing just how widespread the participation has been. And I think another real big takeaway for me has been learning that, as I see it, there is no capital C community. Yes, we have a community, but we're dealing with unique individuals. Everyone is different, and part of the benefit of my job in being hired for the museum is I can treat everyone as a unique individual, either in personal conversations, in my messaging that we're sending out to people. So I have one power user, as we call them, someone who's just at home researching newspapers from the comfort of their couch. And I have a power user who is very quiet, likes to send us hundreds of articles. I don't think I've ever had a phone conversation. Another power user who will call me almost every week, maybe every month, and sometimes have an hour-long phone conversation with me. Same thing goes for our teachers. I'm trying to figure out, I often ask our teachers, for their students, what are your objectives for your students? What do you most want your student to do in terms of primary source reading and analysis and getting involved with the project? We have definitely brought in new audiences through History Unfolded. We work with teachers who were either not working with the museum before, or maybe had worked in particular projects, but not regularly, and have been gotten much more involved. And same thing with our adult volunteers as well. One of the other really neat things about History Unfolded, and a big goal of mine, is we want our data set to be as representative of the country at the time and the individuals living in it. And to an extent that I think increases the appeal of History Unfolded. We don't just want the big mainstream newspapers. We want the rural small town press. We want the ethnic and religious newspaper communities as well. So we have a particular focus right now in the African American press, Catholic and Protestant newspapers. We're looking at labor papers, and we're looking at politically affiliated newspapers. And so that has gotten us to work with particular groups. Like we're working with Gallaudet right now. We're very curious, how did the deaf and hard of hearing community respond to some of the persecution of those with disabilities in Europe? How did the African American press respond? How did Catholics and Christians respond? How did the Jewish newspapers react? And so I think this is one of the appeals for our audience, and also that local level. I was just in Iowa for the trip, and there were people that came up to me after my talk and said, "Did you actually choose newspapers in Iowa for this talk specifically for us?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And that's very motivating to know that we care about your local community. So it's been really appealing, I think, in part because of the connection to people's own experience and background. I think the other thing that makes this project appealing, in some ways unfortunate, is just how relevant so many people see this project today in terms of what's going on in our world. A lot of people feel they want to make a difference. We have a rise of anti-Semitism and a Holocaust denial. And so what we're doing is we're documenting this evidence, and people see the value in that. And they know that this is real research and not busy work.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely true that, people are wanting to participate in projects that feel relevant and important, especially in this moment, projects that will make a difference, which brings me to the question of what projects would you all say are most well suited to using different types of crowdsourcing? Are there any projects that you're working on now that you wouldn't even think of would be relevant, or that you've maybe been ideas that you've been toying with? Like, what types of projects are best suited for consideration for crowdsourcing projects? Who wants to jump in?
I guess I can just say one thing we really learned at the museum, because this is our first full-scale citizen history project, is what I would encourage everyone to do is think about, what are your objectives? Start with your objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? When it came to History Unfolded, we saw there was such a good opportunity here. The museum has been doing ongoing work to document newspaper coverage of the Holocaust, and in general, just to know what Americans have the opportunity to know about the Holocaust and how they responded, and challenge some of these misconceptions that nobody knew anything at the time period and nobody did anything. And we recognized that there was a legitimate need for assistance from the community. And we also knew we had to put a lot of resources and effort into this. My salary, for one, is expensive, in terms of hiring someone to work full time on something like this. To have the resources, we have an internal team that maintains and develops the website, other staff members. A lot of money goes into trying to market something like this. So I think there can be a tendency, while we've been very successful, to just think, oh, crowdsourcing, this is sort of the buzzword, like definitely do it no matter what. That very well might be the case, but think about what your objectives are, and then whether a project like this, where you're involving the community, makes sense to meet those objectives. And for us, we're always thinking about, what actually are the needs of the community. And so we have to do a lot of user testing, a lot of, developing personas, finding out our audience and what their needs are. Because we as an institution may feel like we have so much to offer, but it's not really about us just sort of dictating to people about what's best, but learning and trying to meet them halfway. And so I think if all those things work out and you do small scale experiments and then sort of scale up, it can be very successful.
Great. Katie or Daniel, did you have anything to add to that question?
I would totally agree with Eric. I think that having an objective before you start crowdsourcing, especially if you're trying to attempt an exhibit like we were, was really important. And our objective really was to make our collection accessible to our visitors. A lot of the folks that we get through the door are first or second time museum goers ever. So for us, our curatorial goal was really to try to break down that perception that art is, you have to be educated, or it's scary, or it's contemporary, and you need all these big opinions. Like one of the piece that got third place overall is this full size sculpted flaming electric guitar. And there was this comment on Facebook, and all it said was bitchin'. And as a curator, I totally agree as a curator, you know, it's like, yeah, it is bitchin', you're not wrong. So for us, it was a way to make the museum process and the process of museum going less formal. And so I would totally do it again, because I think it really hit home for our visitors.
Mm-hmm. I think for me too, I would fully agree with all of has been said with Eric and Katie. I think also if you're going to fundraise too on Kickstarter, I think it's good that, yeah, you probably need the money too, but there are definitely, it's best when you run a Kickstarter campaign when you have 2 or 3 objectives on top of that too. So we actually rarely see exhibitions entirely funded by a Kickstarter campaign. Sometimes it's the institution or the artist has a matching grant that's like $15,000, and so they have to raise an additional 15 to get 30. Or sometimes, like with Nevada Museum of Art, that is like a $3 million project. So someone from the board and someone foundation, and then another grant, and the Andy Warhol Foundation all added up to around like 2.5. So then they did a gala, and then they ran a Kickstarter campaign on top of it. And the Kickstarter campaign, of course, it raised, I have it up right here, it raised $76,000. That's just like 10% really, but it's also seen for them as, right, community building. It's about galvanizing your members to actually get excited and get involved. It's to also test out, you know, things that will probably be sold at the store, right? Like a Trevor Pragman print or a book or a patch. It's a way to test, okay, how much of these do we need? Is this successful or not? If the patches are a huge failure, let's go back to tote bags or whatever. But again, it's right. It's thinking about it. Yes, of course, you probably need the money, but there's multiple levels to it too. Maybe it could be a goal of Kickstarter being like what Katie said. We want the Kickstarter to be an entry point for people who have never visited us in the first time. Or in Nevada's case, we want people who are literally not based in Reno to be part of this project. And maybe they come and see the exhibition, that's great, but they knew and they wanted that they had a base of people outside of that, and they wanted to grow that, which to them was huge.
That's great, thank you. And just to remind everyone who's listening, you're free to submit questions anytime. Just use the Q&A button and we'll be sure to ask them. I want to ask about education. So Katie, I know for your project, a lot of people were coming up with their own perspectives of the artwork, which is so amazing. But I'm curious how you know, as a curator, there are always things that you're like, people have to know this about the object. Like they can't look at it and not know this, you know, that's why we always get our labels cut in half. So I'm curious, like, how you relate information to the public, and you know, same with the other projects too. When I think about how to talk to people over the internet, it often becomes like just a huge amount of text that people aren't really going to read every word of. So how do you communicate, how do you educate and communicate as these projects are going on?
We used a little label design magic in the actual gallery. We took comments from Facebook, and then some of the comments were from, you know, Katie Buckingham, anonymous user, who had a sentence or two to add to how the piece was made. Or a lot of it was convenient for us because a lot of the comments visitors left were questions. So on the label, Museum of Glass could answer the question, and that ended up being a pretty relatable format. But a lot of our educating is done through docent tours. So I had the reverse experience. Most of our docents are retirement age. So backing up and teaching them, hey, you know, do you have a Facebook account? this is how we're asking people to relate to this exhibit. And so it'd be great if you could talk about it in terms of how people curate their presence online and how it's similar. So there was a weird reverse education that we had to go through with our docents, which ended up being pretty fun, actually. We had a make your own Instagram account day.
Cool.
Yeah.
And Eric, what would you say? I know that you've done like blog posts and things to talk about ways to go about research. I mean, a lot of the people you're working with might be amateur researchers, never really done that kind of work before. So how do you make sure that they're using proper procedures? You mentioned that with the metadata, they upload an image. Are there other tools that you're using as well?
Yeah, so we use the blog posts for research tips to help people. We assist them, for instance, on the website, and we explain how to do this through the blog, really where to get started doing research. I think one of the big surprises for a lot of people is not everything is on the internet. So especially when it comes to newspapers from the 1930s and 40s, we have on our website, you can go to menu and find newspaper archive, at least an initial listing of archives around the country we're aware of. And then we encourage our participants to contact your local librarian or your archivist. And for students especially, that can be kind of a scary experience. They've never done that before. They don't want to necessarily talk to somebody, but it can also be a very good experience. And so I think that's part of it. Our website is designed to sort of ask step by step for all the metadata that we're interested in. So we have found through the way the website was designed, it actually isn't that bad. We're getting a lot of really good data. And then part of what I do with my team of reviewers is we have the ability to edit those fields. And then one of the best features we added, kind of one of our takeaways as we've learned and grown as a project, is a comment box where I can respond back to the individual. So again, it goes back to these are individuals doing research. So if there's a student or an adult who is struggling like to identify a byline, for instance, I can explain what a byline is after I make the edit, and then they'll enter it in that way in the future, for example, or they don't necessarily understand why the article is not related to the topic. I can explain that way. And I think since this project is considered citizen history, half of what we're doing here is ensuring that it's a high quality educational experience. Our students get really excited, even though sometimes they're not at first when they're looking through the microfilm, and they're forced to read around the event that they're researching for in terms of the context. So in 1933, this is the end of Prohibition in America, and there's lots of stories about that. When we enter the war, there's lots of stories about US troops abroad. And you think about things like the politics at home, all these things that were competing for Americans' interests while the Holocaust is taking place. So students often tell us, just how surprised they were, but then they sort of understand better that like this time of year right now, we have Thanksgiving coming up and then the winter holidays. So in 1942, this is the time in which the final solution is announced and then denounced by the Allies. Not announced, it's when the Allies confirm the final solution and it's denounced by the Allies. And so you can see these competing interests. And we think that's a really big takeaway for our students is they have a much better sense of the context as they're learning.
One question about, we've talked about communication and who these participants might be, but I'm wondering how somebody who's embarking on a crowdsourcing project can get participants in the first place. So we know that not every Kickstarter project succeeds. And Katie, you mentioned that your museum did struggle with getting a lot of Facebook likes and everything. So what advice would you give to someone who's embarking on a crowdsourcing project in terms of ways to engage in publicity? Is it traditional publicity avenues? Are there specific techniques that should be considered when doing crowdsourcing projects? Daniel, do you want to get us started?
Yeah. So I think first off, I want to kind of explain just generally why you would use Kickstarter maybe over other platforms, if that's okay. Because I think that also gives you more context into the just general like crowdfunding in the first place. So there are a few large organizations and companies that are very accessible. Kickstarter, of course, is the one I'm here, and of course I'm biased, but that's usually a space for arts and creative projects. So that can be usually a thing or an exhibition or whatever. There's of course Indiegogo, that's usually majority tech and design projects. So if your project is building a gadget, right, that is usually the space to do it. There's also Gofundme too. And that's usually more philanthropic. So that is like hurricane relief, that is transition surgery, that is like my dog needs surgery. It's much more philanthropic. So if I usually say, if you're someone in the arts and you want to make like a project and you want to share it with something, Kickstarter is usually a good space for it too. That said, of course, like you've mentioned, some campaigns don't succeed, and that is usually primarily their goal was just way too high. And it's something that is like, we need $4 million. And it's like, well, $4 million is not going to drop out of the sky. It takes dedicated time. So I tend to work with a lot with, especially with museums, is work combing through their budget and saying, okay, what piece of the budget can we fill with this Kickstarter? If you have all this extra flex money, let's set that aside for those 10 things, but this one thing, let's fund the Kickstarter for that too. When it comes to really hitting the pavement, it's usually 3 sources. It's one, personal emails. That's what I've said previously too, is this is an excuse to be really informal. So that can be maybe setting a time if you're an institution, 30 minutes on a Tuesday, whole staff meeting, you have coffee, and people are just, you know, writing 2-3 sentence emails to 10 people in their contacts. We've also seen text messaging actually work super well. Sending someone a link and saying, hey, my museum or my exhibition is happening. Can you give it $1? Like, or I think you'd love the $25 reward, or I know you've wanted this work for a while. There's only 10 $100 prints. That can be in a personal email. That can be in a text. There's of course newsletters. So that's usually just 2 or 3 at most. Maybe one announcing the campaign, or one that says we're about to have a Kickstarter campaign. There's one that maybe happens halfway through. That is like an update. That could be, you know, when you've reached 100%. That could be when you're almost there and you only need 10 more people or $100. And then there's usually a newsletter in the end, which is like last few days to support the project. There's of course social media. We've actually found Instagram and Twitter are not that great at converting interest to a pledge. So social media is good at getting interest. Very similar to press too. People see it's happening, it's exciting, they want to be part of it. Maybe they go to the Kickstarter, right? But sometimes that is not enough for them to go from interest to pledge. So that's why we tend to rely on personal emails, newsletters, text messages for some reason work super well. Facebook works the best out of social media if you end up doing a strategy, just because you can tag people too, and it also still feels really intimate. Instagram is hard because there's no click-through and links on posts, and Twitter's sometimes difficult because unless you're asking people to literally retweet it, it's hard to get it on other people's timelines. So that's why we tend to kind of hone in on that too. There's strategies for like, if no one's responded, just follow up with them after 2 weeks. You know, it's similar kind of just development work too. But as long as you have a really solid narrative and the goal feels super achievable, there's like a stat out there that says if you just have at the minimum 25 backers or people that are pledging, you're 80% likely to actually succeed. So as long as you get that, you know, that inertia of 25, maybe that 25 can double into 50, that can double into 100, then you're already halfway there. So that's usually some of the logic of trying to find people.
And is there like an average or anything of how many participants are usually needed to make a project succeed? I mean, I'm sure it depends project to project.
Totally. So for the arts kind of community, for the 4 categories we work in, the average pledge is around $70. So that means a lot of people are pledging like 25, 10, 5, and then there are a few people pledging the hefty, the $750, the $2,000, the $4,000 to get like a Trevor Praglin print or like an Ai Weiwei sculpture too. So if you do simple math, like, oh, my exhibition costs $70,000 and I think I can raise $20,000 on Kickstarter, right? I'm just going to pull out a calculator right now. So if it's 20,000, you divide it by 70, you'll probably need around 250, 300 backers. Then it's worth just going to your newsletter saying, okay, our newsletter's got 1,000 people. Like, we can definitely hit that. Like, if there's enough people that will just have interest but not pledges, but we know we can convert at least 200 of those, then that goal's super achievable. If it's not, then reconsider that goal. Maybe have it be lower too. Maybe then restructure what the rewards are going to be. But it's usually just thinking through that goal amount and the kind of average pledge, and just kind of teasing out how much people will come in, how many you think come out, and then just reevaluating it.
Great. Katie, do you have any advice in terms of outreach? Is there anything you would do differently if you were to run a similar project in the future to get more Facebook likes, or would you use a different platform, do you think?
No, I think Facebook was the right platform for us because it was the easiest to engage and follow up with comments. But the thing I would do differently is I would have, had I known how it would have ended, I would have engaged with the artists far earlier on in the process. The artist who ended up winning was really committed to sharing his link to his piece. And it was exciting because our community got on board. He was really great about sharing personal stories and celebrating milestones when people were voting for him. So I think in the future, I would be more apt to identify other communities than visitors who might engage with the same format.
Great. Eric, you've already talked a little bit about some of your outreach, but did you have anything else you wanted to add about that?
Yeah, I talked a little bit earlier about how I sustain involvement in the project, which is a large part of why we continue to be successful. We see really high return use, which is great. Our teachers often come back and they bring new students, so we're getting new people involved, but with the educator we've established relationships with and our adult volunteers. I'll talk a little bit now about some of our marketing efforts, and in full disclosure, I think we have the challenges a lot of institutions do. Number one, we haven't figured out sort of, the perfect marketing strategy. I think one of the things we find, which is probably typical and maybe somewhat frustrating, is that many different ways of marketing the project are successful to a degree. And so we've sort of come across the fact that, yes, ideally you would market in many different ways. So we have been to a number of different conferences, and there are some we weren't that successful at, and others that we are much more successful at. One in particular, National Council for Public History, is a relatively small conference in size and inexpensive, but the audience is so perfect for us because it's public history professors and others that are really interested in public history. So it's really kind of their ideal fit, and they hear about our projects. We get a very high return on investment for a relatively low cost. The American Library Association Conference has been really successful for us too. Now that's a huge conference, lots and lots of librarians all over the country. That's a lot more expensive, but through that conference, we got a really good partnership with Notre Dame last year, and they have been doing research sprints. This year, we connected really well with librarians from New Jersey and did a webinar series for New Jersey librarians. So you never really know. We've done, like Daniel was saying, a direct email does seem to have some success for us. We did an email campaign through a marketing company, spent lots of money in order to get email lists of educators around the country. And that was somewhat successful in that some of those educators have done the project, but it was also high cost. We right now are experimenting with some targeted ads on Facebook. And because this project has such a strong local focus, we find that the ads that have headlines, in a particular local area, maybe for particular groups on Facebook, has been pretty successful, and that's relatively low cost. The cost is quite minimal for that kind of outreach. A lot of times when I'm talking to people, I'm telling them, tell other people about the project. So if you get those sort of on the ground people who are really involved or willing to do word of mouth sharing of the project with other people, or they know who that person is to contact, we're really trying to find that particular individual who has enough enthusiasm and enough ability to make things happen So sometimes not someone too senior, but not someone too kind of entry level into the organization. That's also successful.
Great. So we have about 10 minutes left of the session. I think it would be great to just go around, and if there's kind of one success or challenge that we haven't yet touched on from your project that you want to share, or a piece of advice. The idea is, lessons learned, like what have we learned from previous crowdsourcing projects. So what is kind of the big thing that someone who is thinking about this, should know going in, or an example from your own project? Katie, do you want to start?
I think for us, and I was chuckling at your comment at the very beginning about being afraid to let go of that curatorial control. It was kind of scary, and we were pleasantly surprised by how engaging the in-gallery experience was. We have 100,000 or so visitors a year, and almost 60,000 of those visitors voted. So given how long they show up, I think pretty much every single person to walk through the door participated. So it was worth the hiccups and the bumps along the road to get that volume of participation. So my advice would be, don't be scared, just do it.
Danielle.
So, okay, I have a few things. One, I think if you want to crowdfund, spend time thinking about it. Don't I agree fully with Katie, is fully into it, but rush into planning it. Don't rush into launching the project. Usually I say best is sketch out a timeline, and also figure out when you're free. Sometimes if the Kickstarter is primarily going to run amongst maybe if you, the curator, and then two people in communications, one person in development, right? If you four are going to do it, that's going to be split maybe 2 hours, maybe, if not more, per day working on the Kickstarter. It's sometimes a part-time job. And if it's your only thing, it can be a full-time job when you run during the campaign. So while the campaign lasts, around 30 days or so, it's worth spending maybe 6-8 weeks before it launches, just working through everything. So of course that includes, for Kickstarter, it includes an introduction video. That's a very quick 1-minute introduction video. It maybe shoots you, it shoots the artist. It says, this is who we are. This is what we want to do. This is why we think it's important. And we want you to be part of us. We want you to be part of the story. There's the text. That's always good working through. Not framing the Kickstarter as please donate, or help us, or instead using language like, come join us, let's be part of the project together. Not only is this money going directly to this, but you can also receive this, and you can go to the preview, you could go to a potluck, whatever. Honing in on that text is great. Thinking about the rewards too. It's best not to think of it as just another gift store too. I'm also in the whole, no one needs another tote bag and no one needs another t-shirt. Think outside the box.
More tote bags.
There's so many tote bags, right? There's just too many of them in the world. So think of it much more creatively, like Trevor's project, right? He had patches, he had limited edition prints. With Ai Weiwei, there were pieces of the project. There were posters that you could paste outside or inside, right? And that feels like it's in dialogue with the project itself. I've had projects that disassemble the exhibition and the wallpaper, for example, and have cut it up and shipped it as a reward too. So the detritus of the project and the materials, those can all be really interesting rewards. And of course, someone who wants to celebrate it, to get actually a physical piece of something that existed in the museum is way cooler than a tote bag, right? So thinking about these things and giving and permitting yourself to think through them with enough time instead of just launching a campaign. Same thing goes for the goal amount, right? Same thing goes for the outreach, who you should be contacting, how much should you be asking them. It takes time, and it takes thinking through this stuff. And if you do it correctly, the campaign 30 days, it will not be like a sprint. It will be a slow walk through the park because everyone's cheerleading you on because they know what's happening. They're getting a piece of the wallpaper. They're going to the exhibition day one, and they can't wait to become a member or something. But it's thinking through this.
I love that comment about not like give us money or do this for us, but come join us. And
Yeah,
like,
always.
That it sounds so much like Katie and Eric, what you're talking about too. Like it's about sharing and doing something collaboratively and together. And it's not just, Eric, you talked about what participants are getting out of this and the educational component for them as well. It's not just about what I'm trying to say is that it's really about a reciprocal relationship, and I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, that it's not a one-way street. It's definitely a two-way street, and the dialogue is so important. That's something that's come up a lot throughout this last hour. Eric, did you have any final comments you wanted to share in terms of advice, successes, challenges?
Sure. Both Katie and Daniel did a great job talking about some of the things I was going to say. I echo their advice. I'll just add that one of the other things we found has been really helpful is to make sure that you can do your best to get buy-in from within your own institution. Depending on the size or the history of your institution, there might be a lot of hesitation to get involved. There might be a lot of confusion about what these efforts actually are. So I mentioned we've been scaling up this project from starting a very small scale kind of part-time project to something that was much more involved. And so for us, we educated our own staff about why we're doing this. We saw the success, and we hired me as a full-time community manager. And then from there, we really built up. And I do updates to our staff about the progress of History Unfolded. I've also gotten a number of our staff members to help out with the review process as well. And so that really helped with the buy-in. Some of our historians at first kind of thought this would be garbage in and garbage out. And so, it's been really rewarding in that sense to do this project and to get that buy-in. I think without that, there would have been such hesitation that we wouldn't have gotten enough of the financial support or the staff support to do that. And so it's kind of critical to sort of gauge at what your institution is like, but then also be willing to take risks and talk about the exciting possibility. And if something doesn't work out initially, try something else and just keep moving forward.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for all of your great advice and guidance. Really appreciate you all joining us today. And just a couple of quick announcements before we depart. We have 2 fantastic webinars that are coming up in the spring, in February and April. Well, spring, I'm on a college campus, so spring semester for me, but not spring weather. So we don't have the dates quite finalized yet, but in February, there will be a webinar on public considerations for accessioning and deaccessioning. And then later in April, we'll have a webinar on responses to conflict zones. So definitely keep a lookout for those. And also, the 2019 Awards for Excellence nominations are due by December 14th. So you can find out more on the AAMC website, but that's December 14th at noon that those nominations are in. So definitely nominate your colleagues and yourselves for awards for all their fantastic projects that they're doing. And that's it. So thanks again for joining us. And I really appreciate everybody's time. Bye.
Thank you.